Welcome back to another episode of Taking Inventory. This week, we really wanted to get into the business of audio. And so we brought the expert in the industry, Bryan Barletta, who's the CEO and founder of Sounds Profitable. Bryan, welcome to the podcast. We're excited to get an education today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm pumped to be here.
So let's start with your background and how you even got into the audio industry, and then we'll dive into kind of you explaining it to us and listeners.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. So I have been in ad tech, I think a little over 15 years now. I fell in love with the iPhone and Android and all that when it first came out. And I started more in like the review space. So I helped start some websites about app reviews. I guess I think at my peak I was reviewing 12 apps a day. So I'd play with them for a little bit, write a review and record it and do video and everything for that. And it was fun. And I got pulled into the ad space because they were one of the companies that I had been talking to was looking for like a developer evangelist. I dropped out of college. I started doing that full time. I moved from Massachusetts to New York, and I just fell in love with ad tech because even though I was building that content, I didn't see myself as a creative person. And advertising to me was always interesting because we got to work with these really cool apps and be how they funded enough to continue to grow or, find adoption, sell, all these interesting things. Throughout that career, about halfway through it, doing a lot of product operations, sales engineer stuff primarily, we were at a company called Adherent, and Progressive Insurance was working with WNYC, and I was on the phone with the seller on our team and those two clients, and they said, "Can we use your tracking technology to confirm attribution on podcasting?" And the seller said yes, and I hit mute and I said, "What are you doing?" And that's how attribution entered podcasting, and that's how I entered the podcast space. I had been a fan of it, and it's one of those things where like I forget. I was like, "Oh wow!" In like 2006, I used to download MP3s and sit in front of my computer and just listen to it on Winamp. And now like we helped bring attribution into the space with Adherent, which eventually became Barometric or acquired by Claritas. Went over to Megaphone, helped build out the ad server and data pipeline for a while. And then recently, I guess not so recently, it's 3.5 years now, I had the opportunity to kind of start a research advocacy trade association-like organization called Sounds Profitable, where our goal was to educate everybody from entry level to executives on how podcasting actually works, right? The difference between a download, a listen, a stream, the technical capabilities of it, the research behind it, and it's just kind of exploded. It's been fantastic. Today, we're working with over 150 companies, all the leaders in podcasting, and some really amazing companies that are growing and doing smart things to kind of shape the whole space, get the apps to improve, get the IAB to do better by everyone, and really make podcasting not just hit $2 billion, which we failed to hit in 2022, but hit $20 billion so we can really be a competitive space.
And, I think, well, two things. One is, I will say just like your audio as a podcast expert is the best audio we've heard yet from anyone we've done this podcast with. So we're, I think, 45 episodes in, and like we got to figure out your setup. And then I guess maybe just for listeners, and you referenced the $2 billion number, but like how big is the podcast industry? Is there a sense, I guess, maybe how big it is, and maybe how top heavy is it? Is there like, is it kind of 80-20 in terms of, the big guys, control most of the market? Just like, could you kind of set the stage or like what the business of the industry looks like?
Let's break it out into two parts. One, I think that COVID and the pandemic in general, like really taught me that I'm very much a hoodie millennial. My camera's not working as we're recording right now for whatever reason, but like I'm always wearing a hoodie. I'm not particularly well dressed most of the time, but I invested in a very nice camera and a very nice microphone because to me that was the new suit, right? We weren't going to get to meet people in person for a while, and it's made a big difference. And now, as people are still connecting virtually, I can't recommend it enough. I mean, the easy thing is a Shure MV7 is a USB-C microphone that is like $250 when it's not on sale, and you can use your iPhone with continuity camera and a little bit of lighting, and it's the first 5 minutes of every call I have. It's super worthwhile to anybody in the professional space that is on, I would say, more than 2 hours of calls a day. I think it's worth it. Digging to the bigger question about audio, it's really tough. We grade things a lot by advertising, right? And so a lot of that is also self-reported, and then the estimates based off of that. So a lot of that is the big companies sharing that info. But like, here's a great example. Branded podcasts, like Pacific Content did Bring Back Bronco a while back for Ford Bronco. That's not considered an ad. So whatever that costs to build, whatever it costs to market and advertise, whatever it costs to grow, isn't considered in that, the sub $2 billion in 2022. So we're missing some pieces there. I think in pure advertising play, yeah, I think that there are the big names, iHeart, SXM, Wondery, Spotify, and then as you get into like public media, NPR, PRX, a lot of great news organizations, New York Times, all of those people are, it's pretty fair to say that if someone buys more than just like Spotify run of podcasting, that they'll eventually buy with one of those people. As you get further down, it's tough. I mean, like smaller shows, when things are billed on CPM, the cost per thousand, it's hard for Athletic Greens or BetterHelp or some of these people to work with incredibly small shows, just because operationally it's difficult, not only to get it set up and vetted, but like to cut the checks. So on an advertising side, yeah, I would say it's probably predominantly the top, the top 200 of most categories are the ones doing the lion's share of revenue. But we don't think about the rest of the industry. We don't think about all the tools and the added costs. Growth and growing podcasts continue to be a big thing, right? How do I get a bigger audience? How do I buy more downloads? Is that marketing or is that ad spend budget? So how are we counting that? Production continues to be a flexible thing, right? Whether someone charges a lot upfront and you own it outright, or they charge less, but they have a little bit of percentage on the IP. We continue to see podcasts go into bigger formats outside of podcasting. We have, Dr. Death getting a new season on there. Lore has been a great example of all of that. Heck, even one of my favorites, Limetown, was made into a TV show at one point. And then we see podcasting being an expansion place for a lot of them. Nickelodeon, which is part of Paramount, right, is doing an Are You Afraid of the Dark podcast on Audible, but it's an Audible exclusive, so there's no ads and you can't listen to it off of Audible yet. Is that counted, right? So I think the industry is pretty large, and I would say that production more and more tends to be in the middle. These production companies that have proven themselves, that price appropriately and, know whether they want to sell the whole thing or hold on to a little bit is pretty middle. I would say pure ad play is probably very heavily weighted on the top.
And so you touched on something there that I've wanted to know, but you talk a lot about podcasts, but then, there are audiobooks. There's audiobooks available kind of within the podcast section of Spotify. There's kind of storytellers who use other content, but then, read it on again, podcasts in the section of Spotify. And so where does that line start and stop where, you're advocating for it and you would consider it part of that 2 billion? And then where does it bleed into maybe something else, an audiobook, another media type?
Yeah, I mean, I think the scientific answer is that it ends somewhere about where the facial hair ends on people's necks for neck beards. Because the truth is, it doesn't matter. Like, I think audio is important, and digital on-demand audio is a better category. I think calling everything a podcast or saying, it's only on YouTube and doesn't have an RSS feed, but they call it a podcast, so it's not a podcast. It's only on Audible and it doesn't have an RSS feed, but it's built like a podcast. It's treated and marketed like one. It doesn't help anybody. It makes our space smaller. So my focus has always been to just highlight on-demand audio being the most crucial part of all of this. That needs to continue to grow. Streaming audio is doing incredibly well, but that's limited on how many partners are in place there, right? Like Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, even like SoundCloud, things like that. There is a limit to how many players are there because they need mass adoption. If I take a podcast and like there's podcasts on the HBO Max app, right? I think there's 2 seasons of a Batman podcast where Rosario Dawson, I might be incorrect there, but like you can't turn the screen off. So what, I'm going to walk down the street with the cover art of Batman on my phone face up so it's not in my pocket and doesn't hit anything. And like I can see the notifications. Like, do we really want to argue that that's not a podcast when the benefit of HBO Max having podcasts in there and there being a Batman podcast with a celebrity outweighs any of the technical garbage that we want to put on it.
Yeah. You just talked about HBO having this. I mean, what was the inflection point that you noticed through your career where people really started paying attention to podcasts, producing them, advertising them? We know the story of Joe Rogan, and he's been doing it for, 10, 15 years. He was early, some of the early media companies. But was there like a single moment in time, or was this kind of a slow burn over the last decade?
I think it really depends on the format, right? I mean, I think a lot of podcasting started as journalists who wrote great stories and were given the opportunity to carve out some of their time to turn it into audio. And then it became more and more of their job. And then it became a higher paid position. And we saw growth and investment in there. And as it further broke out away from just being part of someone's job to being a separate specialized job, the pricings increased, the expectations increased and all of that. And it kind of meant that those companies investing in it had to put more attention on it. Joe Rogan's an interesting one. He had a following. He jumped into something early. If it was a blog or a newsletter, like it could have been the same thing, right? But that was where his audience wanted. And it's not crazy high production value or anything. It's two people talking, right? So that the barrier for entry was pretty low on shows like that. During the pandemic, we saw an increase on that, mostly because people had more time, right? And it's a great way for people to connect. Like outside of the business side of podcasting, like I advocate people exploring audio as a creative art form. I sit down with my kids, 2 and 5, and we just record. We just have fun. We make something up, and it's now a memory, right? That's not published anywhere. Like I send it to my mom. Sometimes we have a friend edit it because it's really fun. But I think that probably in the last 5 years, it became incredibly easy for everybody to just do that. I mean, we're seeing Gen Z record voice memos and share it in group chats and consider that a podcast between their friends. So I think on the big end, we saw an influx of cash with investments from SiriusXM, Wondery, the acquisition of Wondery, the acquisition of a lot of the Stitcher assets, Spotify and all the things they've done there. I think that had like the Hollywood push, and we got some bigger names involved. But I don't know. I really don't know what would be like the big inflection point. I think the easiest thing to say is when we became a joke in SNL, or something like Only Murders in the Building, right? Like I think that shows the adoption there, but that also shows the kind of bad taste it has in people's mouths, right? It's the stereotypical bunch of white dudes talking on a podcast, which is to say that's us right here. But, there's different levels of it and there's different purposes of it.
Interesting. And I guess what's funny, two things. One is you talk about just like kind of doing with your kids. My wife and my daughter have a podcast that they've never published where they just sit here and play with my setup and review chips and like potato chips. And I can tell for my daughter, it does like open up a part of her like brain, and it's definitely just like a different way to think about communication and just like art. So I totally agree, and I think it's interesting how like native it is to that, because she's walking around the house also like yelling at Siri, so she's like used to this in some ways. But aside from that, you mentioned a little bit ago just kind of the industry and like how it's growing and how people kind of look at growth. One thing that Dana and I have talked a lot about is that like for this podcast, like we've never advertised for it. We kind of don't even know where to start. Ironically, one of our best friends runs product at Spotify, so we probably should just annoy him about that. But it's not like app install. At least it doesn't appear to be that way. Where like it was pretty clear, you could go to Meta, you could go to Snap, you could go to Google, and you could start to go ahead and if you wanted to kind of create momentum, you could. Does that exist yet, sort of in this world, or are things as organic as they kind of feel like they are to us?
We're fairly light on technology for growth right now because we don't own the pathways, right? If you assume that most, like when we're talking about growth in podcasting and all of that, we're talking about something on our RSS feed, which means it's in every directory, which means our listeners can be anywhere. They can be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon. We can choose to have it as a cached version of the episode on YouTube, taking it a little bit further out of our hands. You can listen to it on iHeart, NPR, I think, handfuls of apps everywhere, right? And there's tons of independent ones too. So I think growth has been very manual, definitely more art than science right now, it feels like. There's not a lot of products towards it because not everything makes the most sense for a fit. There are a handful of companies out there that have built tools to get by lookalike audience programmatic display ads that will drive people to the podcast, and they'll get them to listen to some of the podcast, but will they get them to convert long term for it? Numbers seem to be between like 2 and 12% for long term adoption from the person who listens in that environment. Do they follow over to their app of choice and continue exploring it? A lot of people do cross promos, either buying them or exchanges with other shows. People do feed drops, so putting an entire episode in somebody else's feed, whether they introduce it or not at the beginning of it. There's so much style and decision. I mean, heck, several years ago, we wrote an article with Jordan Harbinger, and he, at the time, was spending $150,000 a month to grow his podcast. He would just accumulate a list of podcasts, and on Friday, he would just listen through them to get a feel for the host, understand the audience and the subject matter, and identify if that would be a good cross promotion there. And then he would reach out with an offer, usually, to do like a baked in ad. And it was able to grow for him, and he was able to absolutely get a return on that investment. I don't think for most people they can in general, but I think with recent changes to how downloads are recorded, I think we're going to see more emphasis on growth and more identification of who those people we're growing with are.
And you mentioned downloads. That's something, I guess, even like the metrics, like Daniel and I, we constantly are wondering how this all really works. And again, like we come from like the walled gardens where like it's pretty clear. I mean, in some ways they're grading their own homework, but in other ways it's very clear like what an install is or what a video view is. Like, can you maybe just explain to people like what are these metrics? And this is for us too. It's like we see downloads. It's kind of all we see. We see things like Chartable, which seems to be kind of what people look at for rankings, but like it also seems to be a little off at times. Just like, can you give us kind of the state of like the analytics right now?
Yeah, I think our analytics are stronger than it's ever been. We took a lot of punches because people really expect client-side reporting for a lot of things, and that's just not how the system's built. And so when we would get compared to buying Facebook ads or display ads, we weren't really equipped for the first couple of years to really defend against that. But the truth is when you compare us to radio, when you compare us to broadcast television, when you compare it to out-of-home, direct mail, anything like that, we get a lot of power in that. And so the download being our core metric, what that means is when you press play on the app or the app is auto downloading, right? So in Apple Podcasts, it's the easiest one to set for auto download. You can in Spotify, but it's way more steps and it's way less likely that people are doing it. When that request goes out, it calls the hosting platform, which is a glorified file server in that regard, ad server and things like that as well. And that request is sent back, right? So it says, give me the episode. It can say, I only want a percentage of the episode or so much of it. And the hosting platform sends that. When 60 seconds of the audio file have been sent to the listener, we count that as a download because we only know how much was requested and how much we sent, right? So if they ask for it in chunks, and it's 100 minutes and they ask for 10 chunks, it's 10 minutes a chunk. We know how much we're sending, but when we send that first 10 minutes, we don't know if the listener bounced off a minute into it or listened to the whole thing until we get the additional requests. Some apps like Spotify, for example, will ask for the whole file all at once. That's becoming more and more common. But the listen is a app stat that is available in Apple and Spotify. It is not regulated by the IAB in any regard. Between Apple and Spotify, they don't exactly agree on what a listen is, and it's not as granular. It's not broken out one-to-one like downloads are. So it's tough, right? Because that doesn't show the whole audience. And stream, to address that while we're here, there's no real concept of stream in podcasting because everything's a progressive download. When you press play, the hosting platform is sending as much of the file as it possibly can to your player. So if you were to press play and after a minute put it on airplane mode, it would still continue to play. Similar to how if you did that on Netflix, if you watch 5 minutes of a video on your phone and put on airplane mode, it wouldn't just immediately stop. It has some caching to it, right? So download is our core metric. We don't have impression per se because we can't get the client side confirmation that the ad was there, but we have what's called ad delivered. And so just like a download, when 60 seconds of the audio has been sent to the listener's device, when the portion of the episode that contains the ad has been sent to the listener's device, we count that as ad delivered. And those are our two core stats there. Apple recently made a change. A lot of us got together, identified an issue with Apple Podcasts, presented it to them, and they made a change with behavior of how auto downloads work, which reduced some excessive downloading of back catalog. So we saw some download numbers decrease depending on the publisher, 5 to 30%, because iOS 17 adoption was the highest the fastest we've seen in a long time, it feels like. And the Apple Podcast app is built into that operating system. So the only way to update the app is through iOS updates. And this changed the behavior of resuming auto downloading a show that you had previously auto downloaded.
And have you found that companies like Apple, like Spotify, and maybe some of the smaller ones are open to having that conversation and adjusting some of their metrics or how they're operating? Because you are running an advocacy group. And so, like, are you the only ones? Like, who are they listening to? Who's guiding this industry? And like,
yeah, it's tough. I mean, look, we're small. So how do we get Apple to do anything? At the end of the day, like that issue, we presented it to them in June, but it wasn't the first time it was presented to them. It was just the first time that it was presented in that specific light, and it gave them an easy path to make the fix. They went silent for a good majority of the year. We brought it over to the IAB and began working on what we would do if there wouldn't be a fix. And then Apple announced their fix with the launch of iOS 17. That was the amount of notice we had there. They don't have to play ball. There's no rules or regulation on that until all the hosts and all the publishers are willing to stop accepting requests from an app until they fall in line with something. Realistically, that's not going to change. We're kind of at their whim. All of the podcast apps. It doesn't even matter how small they are. I mean, Overcast, for example, chooses to look at the prefixes in your that you put on there for analytics reason and highlight them as like tracking and invasive. And so there's like a big yield sign on podcasts that have prefixes on there. I think some of them they've approved and others they don't. And so what can we do there, right? All you can do is not allow that podcast to be played there and not show up there, and you just hurt some of your audience. So Apple is a very big company. Podcasting is a very, very small part of it. I think they do right by us as best they can. I think the team over there, some of the hardest working people I've interacted with, and I don't envy the rock and the hard place that they're constantly in. Spotify in a similar regard. I mean, Spotify has acquired so much podcast technology, has also laid off a substantial amount of those people. So I don't think that anybody is doing anything malicious. I think that they're all open to improving these things. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of it comes down to, will this financially benefit them, or are there other things that they can prioritize and work on? The IAB has been getting better and better. As we continue to grow, we're able to speak on behalf of the space and talk to these people. And I've recently found that I'm not writing as much for Sounds Profitable, which started as the newsletter and the podcast, because these things that I'm finding as issues, I'm able to help collectively get resolved faster than I can write the article. So I don't have to rally the troops to go talk about it. We're able to make improvements, which is nice. I don't know many industries that are 20 years old that could have change affected this quickly.
And, I guess given the complexity of the space, in some ways it's like the fact that it's so reliant and built on top of RSS is like incredible, and almost like the dream of like open web that people have wanted there to be. But then the trade-off obviously is just, it is complicated and fragmented, at least like for the end user in some ways. Do you anticipate, is there ever going to be a tension where one of these major podcast providers is like, listen, I'm taking it all in-house. I'm moving this off of RSS, and, I'm going to try to own the format? or has that ship sailed and like this way of doing it is pretty solidified?
I mean, I think it's fair to say that Spotify did that, right? And now they have, what, 2 shows left that are exclusive? Call Her Daddy and Joe Rogan. Everything else is open. I could be wrong on that exact number. I think they tried it, and what they found was it wasn't financially worthwhile when they sell ads into all of those episodes by cutting off that audience. I think we're seeing it still a little bit with SiriusXM and Wondery through Amazon, right? We just saw SmartList move over from Wondery to SXM, and it's going to have some benefit for people who use the SiriusXM app. Whether that is a gateway to get more people to subscribe to SiriusXM or a way for them to just use the app as a podcast player, we'll see how all of this pans out. But at the end of the day, they're not going to restrict it from everywhere else because they still make ad dollars off of it. And even if they can have a proprietary view on it, like Spotify has streaming ad insertion, which is basically where the ad breaks normally are, the app takes over and fires a client-side ad call in the app. They call it podcast advertising. It's in-app audio advertising. But by having the metrics between what they serve for standard dynamic ad insertion on the RSS feed and having that streaming ad insertion metrics, they can blend it together and talk about success rate, talk about the value of all of that, and do something unique for everybody. So I think that those unique formats and the ability to pull it off platform sounded nice. I don't think they worked. It wasn't like streaming apps. Nobody wants to have 10 streaming apps on their, or 10 podcast apps on their phone to listen to everything. I think it's too easy to get sucked down one rabbit hole. But I think they're all seeing the financial value of having something unique to draw you over to them. Related to that with the streaming apps, I think that that's going to be the next big push. That's what I want to see, right? I want to see the Succession podcast that Kara Swisher did. I want to see that in the Max app, right? I want to see Henry Cavill talk about Warhammer as like a 6-part miniseries leading up to the launch of that TV show. These are all the things that like would keep me in between seasons of a TV show, or get me to load up Netflix and walk down the street with it instead of loading up TikTok or something other mindless, right? Give that app access to more information. I think that that's going to be the next real push, and that's going to kind of peel apart what podcasting is when all the Hollywood style things end up in these streaming apps, and then what's left is the core things that call themselves podcasting in the long tail.
Do you think that starts to make the industry look a little more like a traditional media company with podcast licensing? So, and I know we've talked about Spotify purchasing content and owning content, or kind of bringing things in house, but more almost like the Netflix model, where now you see HBO content on Netflix, or you see Fox content on Hulu, on Disney, on multiple apps. Because like you said, it is interesting that there is all this companion content. Some of it highly produced, some of it individuals who, during COVID, I listened to somebody reading Harry Potter for the first time. And like, it sounds boring, but it was an extremely compelling podcast. And I think now there's a ton of those. People seeing Seinfeld for the first time, people reading Twilight for the first time. And so with more of that kind of brand associated content, do we see more of a licensed model, or is this something that HBO wants to own and bring in their walls, and Spotify is going to own a portion of it and bring it in their walls, and we're going to see this fragmentation? Where do you think this leads us?
I think some of that stuff, I think that choosing to think it's only going to go one way is the easiest way for this, like, podcasting to be the word that we choose, and that we like kind of the coffin too, right? That's why like on-demand audio is really appealing to me. We need to broaden that mindset, because it's interesting. There's over 5 million podcasts right now. Determining what's active or not is like a really dangerous thing, because there's some shows that release 12 episodes once a summer and then that's it, right? Like, so what, you're going to give them releasing new episodes every year? That's a big window. Like, that's hard to expire people there. There's so much inventory out there that I think that some of the people poised to license it and do things like that, to buy access to it and allow it on other places, are going to be asking high dollar amounts. And those companies that have those listeners or viewers are simply going to turn to those people that do well enough, right? Like, Joe Rogan's killing it, but how many podcasts could you easily just convince to come do something unique with you that are everybody who listens to Joe Rogan's 3rd through 6th podcast, right? Like how you can get that audience in other ways. So I think there's too much room around that. I don't think we're going to see it quite the same way. But one thing I do want to highlight is a lot of people like say that Spotify like failed in podcasting or like real dismissive to them. I think they accelerated our space about 5 years. I think they bought us a lot of information and they figured out very quickly what would or wouldn't work. I think if it would have dragged out, it would have been a real bloodbath. But that boom and bust that we experienced, we still came out on top. We still came out with, if you remove that aspect of it, double-digit growth year over year in the last like 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, and even if you look at, I guess, to that point, like you look at Spotify stock, it's performed incredibly well in sort of near term. And I guess, given that they've sort of figured out that model now, and given maybe that it seems to be, at least as a user, that they are starting to embrace sort of more forms of multimedia, just like you see a lot of video there. Do you think there's like big entrants kind of in the wings? I'm thinking about like Netflix. Like Netflix has got into gaming. Does it like make sense at some point that like they get into this space? And if they were, I mean, are we starting to look at like, on-demand audio is like, jumps from being a $2 billion a year space to, who only knows, because you start to kind of intermingle it with video. Are there rumors of that at all, or is that like very kind of out of left field?
I mean, I think like Netflix is already in podcasting. They have a podcast division. They have several podcasts. I think I'm not sure if you can consume them on the app. I don't think you can. I'm pretty confident you can't. But there's like channels on Spotify and channels on Apple Podcasts with them. Like I know there was like a Stranger Thing one about the girl who worked at the ice cream shop. I'm blanking out on her name on it, but there's like they do a lot of interesting things. They've been really really trying to push that over there. So I don't know. They're pushing into gaming, which is super interesting. As a gamer dad, the idea of anything that makes it easier for me to play a robust game quickly on my phone sounds really exciting. I'll pay for it and never use it. I think that's the model I'm in right now. But you would think that with their investment into video, how easy it is to put an audio player in there, their existing investment into audio, and their exploration into gaming and things like that, if they saw something there, they would have done it, right? Like we watch TikTok bounce in and out of podcasting, we watch Facebook bounce in and out of podcasting. I think the truth is that it's not the turnkey money that a lot of them hope it is, and a lot of them are just not interested in being a leader in a growing space that they could make or break. It's a lot of work.
Yeah, I mean, hearing you talk about just everything going on in the industry right now and how it's just accelerating, and I mean, it's an exciting space, and there's clearly just so much happening that it'll be transformative and it'll be different in probably 2 years' time, it sounds like. But you've been at the forefront of it with Sounds Profitable. Let's dive into that. I'm curious, like, how did you even start an industry group, an industry advocacy group? Like, what does that mean? And like, is this funded by, like, is this like a lobby, like funded by podcasts? Are you charging people? Like, what is an industry group? What is the model? And how does it actually work with players in the industry?
Yeah, so it started because I got fired from Megaphone, and I think not a lot of people talk about when they get laid off from jobs. I think a lot of my career I've been laid off because I'm a squeaky wheel sometimes, right? I think everybody who's worked in advertising longer than 10 years has had to kick the can down the road, and sometimes I'm not interested in that. I believe I can solve it, and that doesn't align with revenue necessarily, or the salespeople don't need to hear those things, and so it can backfire, and I'm well aware of that. And so I wasn't aware that they were trying to sell to Spotify. I mean, they couldn't share that with me, and they wanted me to slow my roll on a few things, and I wasn't particularly interested, and so I was let go, and I realized I wanted to just write. So originally we partnered with Pod News. We ended our relationship with them over a year ago. And I just started writing, and the team at Pod Sites helped get me in front of a few people that I'd already known, but I was like a backroom product manager. I was a sales engineer and things like that. So the peers I knew in passing, but not a lot of us collaborated because sometimes there was competitive product or different things. And so they helped me start out. So it started as a newsletter. We originally had the concept of sponsors. We've since changed it to partners because it's not advertising. I'm happy to share all the details with it because I'm not particularly private about it, but it's $500 a month. We do 3-month minimum commitment for these partners. We have over 150 partners, and we continue to grow month over month with very little churn. The reasons 3-month minimum commitment is because there's so many benefits and I want people to make sure it works for them. I'm not particularly here to charge people a year and, if they show up, they show up type of thing. We do half an hour of consulting with each of them once per month. We have open office hours with my business partner, Tom Webster. He came over from Edison Research, 20 years leading research in podcasting, hands down the face of research in podcasting. And he's come over and we built our entire research line that is all guided by us with input from some of the partners that participate in that, funding that, but no editorial control on that end. We do live events every quarter. All for our partners, no additional cost. We cover food and drink, usually networking to help people benefit from some of the trade shows that we're at there and make sure that everybody has more meetings and everywhere they're spending money, they get more value out of. We do all of our content's free without ads on it. So six newsletters a week, 4 daily, a weekly thought leadership on Wednesday, and then kind of a recap on that Friday to make it easy for what people want to digest. And then we built a research database, which was pulling in all the research we read, not just the things we released, which we release new research at least every quarter. And that research database has been great for people who are going to go pitch Toyota and, want to find out about the overlap between automotive and podcasting. And so, I started the company with no investment. My opening offer to Tom was half the company because he's just a legend in the space. Like, I was inspired by a lot of what he did and I wanted to work with him. And we don't take equity advisory or board seats in any external company. We don't work on commission or kickback, and we sign MNDAs with any of our partners. We also work with external management for our personal and family finances so that there's as little conflict of interest as possible on everything. And that's allowed us to continue to be for profit, which allows us to take big swings. I mean, we bought an entire day at South by Southwest. We have the only official podcast day at South by Southwest, and it was 6 figures. To purchase this, and if I had to explain why to a board, that would have been ridiculous. And best case scenario for us, we only lose like $30,000 if we succeed. And the end result is that South by Southwest does something bigger with podcasting in 2025. They do an entire podcast track, 3, 5, 7 days with business during the day and performances at night, so that we can be in front of a bigger audience, so we can get that spotlight. So we kind of fell into it, right? Like it was a lot of like technical writing and things like that. It was a lot of consulting. We're careful around the word trade association because we never asked anybody to sign on that, but we have always been advocacy and research and support. And we emulate a lot of aspects we like over MediaLink, but substantially cheaper, priced for our industry, I like to say. And it's just been I'm very fortunate. Tom and I are very fortunate. We have Manuela and Gavin on the team as well. So we're just a 4-person team. I don't know, in my entire career, I've never seen an industry that I could have this much of an impact on, and we don't take it lightly. And so when we have the opportunity to do things to just grow the space, there's not a financial element behind it. I'm sure Tom and I could make way more money somewhere else, but our goal when we decided to do this was to make this industry bigger and better. And so that when my kid tells people that his dad works in podcasting, people don't laugh.
Like that. And the fact that you guys have a 4-person team and pump out that much content, and if nobody has read some of your content, they should. I mean, the depth that you guys go into and the detail, hearing it's 4 people and you guys are doing like live events and consulting on the side, like that's remarkable. You do work with like names both on the advertising side and more kind of media, like podcast media. And so like AG1 kind of jumped out on your site because I think if anyone's listened to a podcast, they've heard an AG1 ad, at least one. And so how do you work with advertisers and I don't even know how you categorize them, podcasters or producers? How do you work with them differently? And are these companies coming to you? Or are you guys actively selling? Like, what is the dynamic to start to partner with these companies?
Yeah, I mean, we're about 3.5 years in, and we've never done paid marketing at all. And in fact, if anybody's listening to this and skilled at doing paid user acquisition on Beehive, with the last episode you recorded recently being about Beehive, I'd love, please reach out, because we'd love to explore that. But because we don't do advertising, right, like it that doesn't benefit us necessarily, other than vanity, I guess, more getting our word out. But it's been a lot of word of mouth. It's the people that we talk to and we help. When somebody, like, it's been very fun when a sale goes through or a deal goes through. I get a lot of text messages and emails. People want to talk about it or have thoughts and ideas around it. When people lose their job or are looking to change their job, they reach out to us now, and we're always happy to connect them. We created a job board because of that. So a lot of these people come organically, recommended by other people. They'll be dealing with a problem, and someone will say, Brian or Tom can help you out with that. They'll make the intro. And a lot of time I end up just doing the consulting the first time to solve their problem. And then I send them info about partnership. It's not really a hard sell on my end. There becomes a line where I can't continue to do free consulting with the 150 plus calls I take a month already. But a lot of those partners have been around for a while, like Athletic Greens, BetterHelp, Vessi are the advertisers we work with. We work with about 11 agencies. We work with every major hosting platform that has dynamic ad insertion or programmatic ads. We work with all the major publishers and the production companies in so many different categories. And a lot of what I do is, I want to hear what the problems are. When I hear it 2 or 3 times, then it's an industry problem. How do we collectively solve it? As I'm talking to one company, I'm trying to figure out what they're working on that's good or bad. Are they a solution, or do they need a solution from any of the other partners? So I spend a lot of Monday and Friday making warm introductions to people. And because there's no kickback or commission or anything like that, like when I make that introduction, it needs to stick. The person I connected them to needs to want to have that meeting. Because if they don't, then they're going to be less likely to open my email next time. So everything I do has to be really well thought out. We, for the first time, just started working with a PR agency, Palmer Public, and we're really excited because we are the biggest thing in the business of podcasting on coverage and research and all of that. But we now need the spotlight bigger than podcasting here. And so we want to be that vessel. So we need to get our research in bigger places. We need to get our news in bigger places, our perspective, and that benefits all the partners we bring with us. But I don't think we'll ever hire a salesperson. I'm accidentally the salesperson. I do a little bit of prospecting every now and then. I create lists of people that we'd like to work with, but I don't, there are a handful of people that have a problem. I help them solve it. They ask about partnership and I say, come back in a little bit. I don't think we can get you the dollar value out of this. And I really want to make sure that happens before you come on board here. Because I don't want anybody to have a bad taste in their mouth. As someone who spent $30,000 testing out different organizations and memberships and trade associations last year, I did not get my money's worth. So I don't want anyone to ever say that about Sounds Profitable.
Yeah, it makes sense. I guess before we wrap up, just given your expertise in this space, what does it look like? Let's not use 10 years. That's too far out. What does the space look like 5 years from now?
Yeah, I think we're seeing the shifts already today. I think the industry has moved from a startup space to a long-term space. I think you're going to see a lot of turnover on the executive level for companies that startup founders as their CEOs and things like that to more like long-term. As we get out of thinking, 6 to 18 months at a time and think in the phase of 3 to 5 years, right? For a lot of these companies, what does that look like? So you'll see some leadership change to long-term. You'll see some right-sizing of the employees and the structure of the companies. I think that's on the big business side of it. I think what I'm really excited is a resurgence of let's call it mid-level content, right? Like a lot of these amazing content creators got swallowed up by these very large production companies that sold for a lot of money and had a lot of pressure and may or may not have delivered, right? So those people may have gotten laid off. Some of them, I hope they found better jobs and all of that. But I think the pay that a lot of them were receiving probably was was part of the problem that led to our bust overall. And now these people are going to have the opportunity to build something unique and take a gamble on it and get it in front of these big people and have more long-term success. I think we're in kind of a drought, it feels like, with new interesting content. I think we're overdue for it. And in that 5 years, we're going to see it. But overall, I'm excited for it. I think we are a longer term industry now. We're more confident. We're not having to defend all of our metrics and points of view. We're not having to argue for the value and the success of it as much as continue to present that value. And I think the biggest thing is in that 5 years, we'll be out of the test budget phase. We will be part of someone's core model, which, having been in ad tech for a while, I remember search and social begging to still be a test budget. And we're over here like, no, integrate us in fully. But as an industry that only receives IP address, user agent, timestamp, and what episode you're listening to, I think with cookies and deprecated data signals and all of that, we stand to show people how to do it right. We're a great example of that, and I hope people lean into that more.
And so anyone listening that wants to learn more about what you do at Sounds Profitable, wants to follow you, wants to see some of your research reports, where can they find that information?
SoundsProfitable.com has it all there. My name's Bryan, so Bryan at Sounds Profitable. I spell it with a Y. You can spell it with an I. I've set up the alias. And if you hit reply to any of our newsletters, I'd love for you guys to check out our newsletters too. Like anybody who's listening, subscribe to them. Seriously, if you hit reply, it goes into my inbox. I do make it a priority to answer every single email and talk to everybody. I will make time to hop on the phone if it makes sense so I can help people out. I really want to grow this space. But all the research is up there. We've been doing it now for over a year and a half. It's freely available for both the file, and I really recommend watching the video presentation from my partner, Tom. He is a wizard when it comes to explaining why this is important. Especially our latest one, Sound You Can See, all about video podcasts and how the industry is more confused than the consumer on that one. And then, buy more podcast ads, explore it, right? Build a podcast, just be active in the space, advocate for it, and make like 10% less jokes about podcasting. And those are other great ways people can support the industry.
Yeah, seriously, if anyone is interested, even remotely in podcasting, check out the work that they're doing over at Sounds Profitable. And again, the fact that it's free and you guys are pumping out that much content, unmatched in the industry. So, Bryan, we appreciate you joining us today, walking us through the entire industry, the history, where we're going. Thank you. And, we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks for having me.